morning, guys. So today we're going to start working on our first spring concert piece. This is Tedihe by Andy Patterson. Hopefully you guys all downloaded the music yesterday and listened to the piece through the link that I provided. If you haven't done that yet, you need to do that before you start this lesson. So there will be timestamps below in the description box so that you can just skip to your section's instruction. I'm going to start with the first violins, but if you're not a first violin, just go down to the description box and click on the link, and that'll take you to the part of the video that talks about your part. So make sure you have a pencil, make sure your instrument is tuned, and let's get started. All right, first violin. So the first thing we're going to do, take your pencil, we're going to mark some things. Today we're going to be talking about the first 10 measures. So I'm going to talk you through what you need to mark in your music, and then I'll show you what it should look like in your part. So first of all, starting in measure 3, the last A, that last eighth note in the measure, you're going to use a fourth finger. So put a 4 over that note. In measure 4, for the G sharp, you're going to use a high 3. So put a 3 or a arrow up 3. In measure 7, you're going to need to use a low 2 for the F natural at the end of the measure. Put an arrow down above that or a natural sign. It's not a change from the music, it's just to remind you because you'll have to use a high 2 previously in that measure to play the B natural and the G string. Okay? Moving forward in measure 9, the last note of the measure, it looks like a D, but if you'll look earlier in that measure, there's a D sharp, and that accidental is going to last through the entire measure. So I want you to put another sharp sign before the last D in the measure just to remind yourself of that last D sharp. And you're going to play that with a low 1 too if you want to mark it. In measure 10, the first D, you're going to use open D, so you can put open above that. Then the second 2 notes in the measure, if you're an inside player, okay, and we're just going to go off of our festival seating. So if you're an inside player, you'll just stay in first position, obviously. You'll use a fourth finger for that E, the third note. But if you're an outside player, we're not going to do the fingering that they suggest. So the second note, you're going to go up into third position on a second finger for the E. And then you're going to use a harmonic for that high E, and I'll show you what that's going to look like, but basically mark that you're going to shift to third on the E, and then put a little circle above the 4. That's how you show a harmonic. And then for the last 2 eighth notes, if you're an outside player, you're going to shift down to first position on that low 2 for the C. And then we'll finish with the half note starting measure 11, the A. Go ahead and use a fourth finger for that. So I'm going to show you what the music should look like now that you've marked these things. The next thing we're going to talk about is the rhythm. Obviously, there's a lot of triplets marked in this part. So let's take a look at measure 3, for example, the first measure that you play. So we're in 4/4, and you have a half rest to start the measure, which means there would be 2 beats left in the measure. Okay? When you have a triplet, what you're doing is you're playing 3 notes in the space where 2 notes would normally fit. Okay, we've talked about this a little bit before, but you're seeing it in action here. So instead of having 2 quarter notes, you've actually got to squeeze in 3 quarter notes, and that third quarter note is split into 2 eighth notes. Okay, so let's just talk about, pretend the eighth notes are just a quarter note for a second. Okay, so the rhythm would be rest, rest, triplet. Rest, rest, triplet. Now, since the last 2 notes are eighth notes, the let part of the triplet is going to be divided in half. So now it's going to be rest, rest, triple eighth note. Okay, it'll make a little bit more sense when I play it here in a second. So you've got that rhythm in measure 3, measure 5, measure 7, and kind of in measure 10. Let's talk about measure 10 really quick. So in measure 10, you've got 3 quarter notes at the beginning. Now remember, we're in 4/4, so you've got 4 quarter notes total in a measure. So the first 3 quarter notes are there. Then the last quarter note has another triplet symbol. This is a different type of triplet than we were dealing with in measure 3 and the other measures we just talked about. The ones we were dealing with in measure 3 was a quarter note triplet. So it was 2 quarter notes worth of beats squeezing in 3 quarter notes. This is 2 eighth notes worth of time where we're squeezing in 3 eighth notes. Now take a look at the end of measure 10. So this is 1 beat, okay, that they're asking us to squeeze in 3 eighth notes. So what they've done, the first eighth note is a rest, and then the second 2 are actual notes. So what this is going to sound like is 1, 2, 3, triplet, 1, 2, 3, triplet, 1, 2, 3, triplet. The first 3 beats are just normal quarter notes. Since the first of the 3 eighth notes is a rest, we're not going to say the tri part of the triplet. So it's going to sound like 1, 2, 3, a let. 1, 2, 3, a let. Okay, so ba, 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 ba. That's what it's going to sound like at the end. And like I said, it'll make more sense when I play it in a second. So let's go ahead and go through, and I'm going to play for you some of these measures so that you can hear what they should sound like. All right, so we're going to go kind of measure by measure. I've got my music stand over here, so hopefully I'll be able to be on screen, even though I know you won't be able to see my fingers too well. So let's take a look at these measures that have the first quarter note triplet pattern. So that's 3, 5, and 7. So remember, it's going to be rest, rest, triplet. Okay? So first let's just play it on open D. Okay? So it would be rest, rest, triplet. Okay? Let's try it again. What? Ready and rest, rest, triplet. Okay? Now we're going to change the third quarter note into 2 eighth notes. So it's going to be triple eighth note. Okay? So it would be rest, rest, triple. Okay? Now we're going to play it with the actual notes that are on the page in measure 3. Rest, rest. And that's all it is. So understanding the counting behind it will definitely help, but if that was all really confusing, and since I can't hear your questions, you can also just learn it by ear. So that's the rhythm for number 3. This is what measure 5 would sound like. Rest, rest. And here's measure 7. Rest, rest. Okay, so rest, rest, triple eighth note. Okay, and on that last measure, measure 7, make sure you get the low 2 F natural at the end. Okay, now let's look at measure 10. This is arguably the more difficult measure out of these, out of this section. So let's start with playing the inside player's part. And if you're an outside player, you can practice this too because it's an octave, so you're playing the same note, only higher. So remember, the first 3 beats are just straight quarter notes. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, triplet. So let's play that on open D, pretending that that eighth note rest is an actual note. So it'll sound like this. 1, 2, 3, triplet. Let's do it again. Ready, go. 1, 2, 3, triplet. Okay. Now let's take out the first of the 3 triplet eighth notes so that we can mimic the rhythm that's actually in the measure. Here we go. And 1, 2, 3, let. One more time. And trip. Okay. Now we're going to play the inside player's part with the actual notes. Ready, go. One more time. Okay. Now we're going to play the outside player's part. Remember, you're going to be shifting on the second beat to third position on a second finger for the E, and then you're going to use a harmonic. So here we go. Ready, go. Okay, but with a fourth finger there in the end. All right, so now that we've kind of talked through all of this, I'm going to play the entire segment, and I'm going to put a metronome in my ear so that I can make sure that I'm going exactly 86, and hopefully you guys will be able to practice along with me. Okay, so here is the first 10 measures of the first violin part. We're going to start out by resting for 2 measures. So here we go. 1, 2, ready, and go. Rest, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Okay, so that's all we're going to do for today. So go ahead and practice those first 10 measures, and tomorrow we will tackle the next part. Good luck! All right, we're now looking at the second violin part in Tedihe. There is only one thing that I want you guys to mark before we get started, and that is in measure 7. The last note is an up bow. This isn't a change, it's just a little odd because the first note of measure 8 is also an up bow, and generally when you have 2 in a row, you mark both of them, even if one occurs naturally. You might even want to mark the C before it as a down bow, so I'll show you what that's going to look like. That's the only weird thing in this. Otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. We're just looking at the first 10 measures today. So in measure 6, you'll see there's a divisi part. If you were an inside player for festival, you'll play the C, and if you're an outside player, you'll play the D. Other than that, let's talk about the rhythm that we have here. So the main rhythm that you have is an eighth rest, a quarter note, an eighth note, and then an eighth rest, quarter note, and eighth note. And that rhythm repeats a lot throughout this part. This is a syncopated rhythm, but it's fairly straightforward. There's no triplets involved. I will tell you that there are triplets happening in other parts, so you'll have to really focus and make sure that you're not doing anything funky. You're just counting straight eighth notes. So we're in 4 here. So if you're subdividing eighth notes, you're going to be thinking 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. On that first measure, and every measure like it, you'll be resting for the first eighth note and then in for a quarter note, which is 2 eighth notes. So you'll be rest and 2 and rest and 4 and. Okay? Rest ba 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 ba. And we're going to make sure to make that eighth note really nice and crisp and short. You could even put a dot on it if that'll help you remember, because we want to make sure it doesn't bleed over into the rest. We talked about this a little bit when we were sight reading, practicing sight reading for festival. If you have a note that directly precedes a rest, it's really important that you clip it off before that rest is supposed to start. Otherwise, it can kind of muddy the rhythm that's supposed to be happening. We need to hear that rest really clearly. In measure 4, you come in at the same time, but then that first eighth note that you would, or the first note that you would normally play, is actually tied through to the rest of the measure. So in measure 4, it's going to be rest and 2 and 3 and 4 and hold for the entire measure. Okay? In measure 7, like I said, the bowing is a little interesting because you have to go up, up at the end. So it's rest down, up, down, up, up, down, up, down, up, down. Looking at measure 8, the rhythm is fairly straightforward. It is syncopated, so you're going to be changing bows off the beat. So you have 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. You'll notice that instead of doing eighth note, quarter, 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 eighth, they've given you 2 eighth notes that are tied together in the middle. And you might think, since it's the same note, why didn't they just give us another quarter note? Some of you may have guessed this already, but it's indicating one half and the other half of the measure, just to visually kind of organize the measure in a way that we're used to seeing. In measure 9, that D sharp, we're going to play with a low 1. In fact, why don't we go ahead and mark that, like an arrow down and a 1, and then that sharp accidental will last through the entire measure. So the second note in that measure will also be a low 1, and I want you to put a sharp next to that. And then measure 10, we're going to end on an open D. You can use a 4th finger if you can play it in tune, just make sure it's really in tune. So once you've marked that in your music, it should look like this. Okay, I'm going to go over and play some of these rhythms for you before I play the entire section. So, starting at measure 1, talking about this rhythm that repeats over and over again, remember it's rest and 2 and 4 and 2 and 4 and. So it sounds like this. rest, 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 rest. And you'll notice that I'm cutting that second note really nice and short so that it doesn't bleed into the rest. And I'm actually coming off the string. If you can come off the string on the up bow, that'll really help. Okay, let's take a look at measure 7 and 8, where you have to do the double up in the middle. I'm going to start with measure 8 just so that we can get that rhythm. It's a syncopation that lasts through the entire measure, so it's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Sounds like this. Okay, you might want to practice that on its own a few times and then add the pickup. So the pickup would be that up bow C natural right before measure 8 starts. So it would sound like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Let's do that one more time. 2, 3, and 4. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. It might take some practice to make sure you can get that double up in there. So now let's put measure 7 and 8 together. 2, 3, and 4, and 1. And then measure 9, low 1. Okay? All right, I'm going to put a metronome in my ear at 86 to make sure I'm going exactly the correct tempo, and you can play along with me if you'd like. All right, so I'm going to play the second violin part, measures 1, and then stopping at measure 11. Here we go. 1, 2, ready, go. As you practice this, really try to make sure that you're getting that lift on the second eighth note of each set of quarter note, eighth note pairs so that you can clear out that rest. And other than that, happy practicing, and I will see you tomorrow for the next part. All right, now we're looking at the viola part of Te Dihe. The first 10 measures is what we're going to take a look at today. So before we do anything else, I want you to get a pencil and we're going to mark a couple of things. These first 10 measures are pretty straightforward. There's just a couple of things I want you to mark down. The first being in measure 7. The first 2 notes are normal, but the last 2 notes, I want you to put a down bow over the quarter note and an up bow over the eighth note. The reason for this is there's actually a double up. You'll see the first note of measure 8 is marked as an up bow, and I think that it'll just help to mark those 2 preceding bowings, a down and an up. So once you've marked that, it should look like this. Okay? And then the last thing I want you to mark is in measure 10. You've got a G sharp, and you're going to play it as a low 1. So however you want to mark that, I just put an arrow down and then a 1. Okay, so let's talk about this rhythm that you guys have a lot through here. It's eighth note or eighth rest, followed by a quarter note, then an eighth note. 8 rest, quarter note, eighth note. So this is a syncopated rhythm, but it's not a triplet or anything like that. I will tell you that there are triplets happening in some of the other parts, so you'll have to count really well and make sure that you're not trying to do anything funkier than it actually is. So the syncopation comes in where we are actually going to be changing bows off of the beat. So instead of starting our bow at the beginning of the measure, we're actually resting for an eighth note at the beginning of the measure. So we're in 4/4 here, so if you were subdividing eighth notes, you'd be thinking 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Okay? Since you are resting on the first eighth note, you're going to be playing rest and 2 and rest and 4 and ba 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 ba, and that's the rhythm that happens throughout most of this part. The only time it changes would be in measures 4 and 6, where you're actually coming in at the same time after that first eighth rest, but then you're going to hold through the rest of the measure. So it'll be rest and 2 and 3 and 4 and off, and then the other pattern continues. In measure 8, you have a little bit of a different rhythm. It's still syncopated, but you continue that quarter note syncopated pattern throughout the entire measure. So it's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. But ba, 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 ba. You'll notice that instead of just giving you 3 quarter notes in the middle of the measure, there's actually an eighth note tied to an eighth note in the middle of the measure. And you might be thinking to yourself, why did they put a tie in the middle of the measure when they could have just given us a quarter note? The reason is that the publisher wanted to indicate a little bit of division between the first half of the measure and the second half of the measure. It just makes it a little easier to read when it's divided up like that. So that rhythm right there, we're going to go over in a second, but it's just kind of an extension of the syncopated rhythm we've been doing all along. So I'm going to play through a couple of these things before we play through the entire section. So starting at the beginning, this repeating rhythm that you see through most of this, remember it's rest and two and four and. So it sounds like this. Rest. So you'll notice that I'm actually lifting my bow off of the string after the eighth note and then setting it down during the rest. And that's a really good way to keep your tempo steady, is actually having a movement happen on a rest so that you're not just gauging it out of thin air. Okay? Then let's take a look at measure 8. Okay, this is where it goes to syncopation with no rests. So it's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And remember, it starts on an up bow, so it sounds like this. 3, 4. And remember, anytime you have syncopation, it helps to put a little bit of a break in between and accent the bow changes so it doesn't sound like an accident. 2, 3, 4. And then you can add the measure before, which is measure 7, 2, 3, 4, and 1. Up, up. Make sure you get that up, up in the middle. We're going to try that one more time. 3, 4, and 1. Okay. Other than that, it's pretty straightforward. So we're going to go ahead and play through this entire 10 measures. I'm going to put a metronome in my ear so I can make sure I'm going exactly 86. And if you want to play along with me, go for it. Okay, so here's the first 10 measures of the viola part of Te Dihe. Here we go. 1, 2, ready, go. Make sure that you're really trying to lift the bow off the string after the eighth notes and set it down on the eighth rests. All right, happy practicing, and I'll see you tomorrow for the next part. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the cello part of Te Dihe. We're just going to be looking at the first 10 measures today. Before we do anything else, get your pencil. There's something I want you to mark in. If you look at measure 7, the last 2 notes are a quarter note and an eighth note A. I want you to mark the quarter note on a down bow and the eighth note on an up bow. We're not changing the bowing here. I'm just writing it down as a reminder because you'll notice that measure 8 starts as an up bow, and that actually is a double up because the way it comes, the last eighth note of measure 7 will be an up bow. So by marking in those 2 preceding bowings, it'll help you remember to do the double up. So once you mark that in, it should look like this. Okay. Other than that, there's really nothing you need to mark in. There are a lot of A's throughout this section. If you want to play it up in position, that would be fine. Just make sure it's in tune. Otherwise, you can just play open A. So before I play this for you, let's talk through some of these rhythms. You'll notice one repeats a lot, and that's the rhythm that you see in measure 1. It's a syncopated rhythm, meaning that you're going to be changing your bow off of the beat. You come in on the and of 1, and every time you change the bow, it's not on the beat, but it's on the and of a beat. Since you have rests, you're going to be subdividing, so you'll be subdividing in 4/4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and since you have a rest at the beginning, you're going to have rest and 2 and rest and 4 and 2 and 4 and. Okay? And this repeats a lot. So once you get it, you've got it. There is just a couple of little changes. Measure 4 and measure 6, you'll notice that you are still coming in on the and of 1, but now you're tying that to the entire rest of the measure. So it'll be rest, and 2, and 3, and 4, and off. You'll just have to make sure that when you're playing that you're subdividing in your head. Okay? The other little rhythmic thing I wanted to point out is measure 8. You don't have any rests in this measure, so the subdivision becomes a little bit different, or I should say the rhythm becomes a little different. You're still subdividing 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and you start with an eighth note, so it's going to be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and ba 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 ba. And I'll play that for you in a second. You'll notice that there are 2 eighth notes in the middle that are tied together, and you might think, why didn't they just give us a quarter note? Because 2 eighth notes equals a quarter note, and if it's the same note, it would sound the same. The reason for that is the publisher wants to give you a visual delineation between the first part of the measure and the second part of the measure. The only reason is just it makes it a little easier to read when we have that visual kind of cut off between the first half and the second half of the measure, instead of just putting a quarter note smack dab in the middle of the measure. So let's play through some of these parts that are a little rhythmically challenging, starting out with the first measure. So remember, you're resting on the first eighth note, so it'll be rest, and 2, and 4, and 2, 3, 4, rest, and you'll notice that I'm picking the bow off the string on the eighth notes and setting it back down on the eighth rest. And this is a really good way to keep your tempo steady by actually putting a motion together with a rest, because on a rest normally we're not moving, but if you can do something like setting the bow back down on the string, it can help you keep track of how long that rest should be. Take a look at measure 4, and this is the same as measure 6. We're going to come in on the and of 1, and then we're going to subdivide in our head while we keep holding that bow through the rest of the measure. So it'll be 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and off. Okay? Last but not least, looking at measure 8. Remember, this is this is a syncopated measure with no rests. So it's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Sounds like this. 3, 4. One more time. 3 and 4 and. And anytime you have syncopation like this, where there's no rest in between, it helps to accent a little bit each bow change and put a tiny break in between each note. It just helps it not sound like an accident, and it sounds intentional instead of sounding like you're just getting behind or ahead. Okay? Once you've practiced measure 8 a few times, you can back it up and add the pickup to measure 8, so it would sound like this. Remember, this is a double up. The last note of measure 7 and the first note of measure 8 are up bows, so it would sound like this. 2 and 3 and 4. And then once you've practiced that, you can add the entirety of measure 7 and play 7 and 8 together. And that's going to sound like this. 2, 3 and 4 and 1. I would recommend leaving your bow on the string after the last note of measure 7. You know how I said that we were lifting the bow off the string on every eighth note? This is one exception to that, because if you lift your bow off the string, it's going to be more difficult to catch that second up bow. So just in this one case, I would recommend leaving your bow on the string for the double up. Okay, so now I'm going to put a metronome in my ear at 86, and if you want to play along with me, go for it. I'm going to play the first 10 measures starting from the beginning. 1, 2, ready, go. Okay, so happy practicing. That was the first 10 measures, and I will see you tomorrow for the next section. All right, we're going to take a look at the bass part of Te Dihe. We're just going to be looking at the first 10 measures today. So there's really nothing that you need to mark, but I want to talk you through some of these rhythms before we play it together. So taking a look, first of all, at measure 8, you've got a syncopated rhythm here. There are no rests in this measure, and it is off the beat. So you're going to be changing your bow on the and instead of on the beat. So it starts as an up bow, and if you're subdividing eighth notes, it'll be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and starts on an eighth note, so the rhythm is going to end up sounding 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and ba 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 ba. This is a rhythm that you guys have seen before. Anytime you're playing syncopation like this, where there's no written rests, it'll help if you put a little bit of sting on the beginning of the note and release a little bit early on the end of the note so it sounds intentional instead of sounding like you're just getting ahead or behind the beat. Okay? The only other thing I wanted to point out were these triplet rhythms in measures 4 and measure 6. These are quarter note triplets, as you can see. Since we're in 4/4, a quarter note triplet is going to be putting 3 quarter notes in the space where 2 quarter notes would normally go. So take a look at measure 4. You've got the first 2 beats are straight. The first 2 beats are normal, right? 1, rest, triplet. Normally it would be 1, rest, 3, 4, but they're wanting us to fit 3 quarter notes instead of just 2 in the second half of that measure. So 1, rest, triplet. And it always helps to kind of say triplet in your head when you're playing it. So let's play through just those 2 rhythms, starting with the one in measure 8. That's just straight eighth notes with a little bit of syncopation. Watch the bowing here. Measure 8 starts on an up bow. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. One more time. 3 and 4 and. Okay? And it helps to let your bow come off the string just the tiniest bit after those eighth notes to really give that nice separation. The other rhythm I want to point out is the one in measures 4 and 6, just like we just talked through. Let's play it on open D first and pretend that that rest is another note, right? So it would be 1, 2, triplet. Again, and 1, 2, triplet. So since during the triplet you're fitting 3 quarter notes in the space of 2, you're going to be moving your bow faster even though what you're looking at looks like normal quarter notes, okay? So now let's play it with the actual rhythm still on open D. So 1, 2, ready, go. Rest, triplet. Again, and rest. Okay, now let's play it with the actual notes. 1, 2, and go. Rest. Okay, and then in measure 6, you've got different notes, so let's take a look at that. 2, ready, go. Rest. Okay, pretty straightforward. So now I'm going to put a metronome in my ear at quarter note equals 86. If you want to play along with me, that's great. And here's what it sounds like. 1, 2, ready, go. Okay, that's it. That's the first 10 measures. Happy practicing, and I will see you back here tomorrow for the next section.